Good afternoon, everyone. So the topic of this presentation is enabling the promise of PAT with a digital platform. And I'll get into the title as the presentation goes on. Agenda is we're going to start with the PAT promise, but then we're going to focus on the critical digital strategy. We'll go through the current PAT adoption workflow as we've seen it, and then I'll present what a modern PAT approach can look like. So this is the current PAT promise in 3 high-level steps. So step 1 is to characterize raw materials and process intermediates using things like Raman or NIR spectroscopy. Step 2 is to enable us in real time to respond to changes through available process controls. So we see something that's affecting our output, or maybe we predict it, we can respond to that. And on the outcomes, we can maximize performance, we can avoid failed batches. This inline monitoring can, down the road, enable real-time release. It's a little bit more complicated than that to achieve each of these outcomes. So step 1, characterizing raw materials and process intermediates, it's going to require connecting data, so the data systems, and then so your control systems, this PAT, and then we have to build and deploy and maintain models. So the models that are, turning that PAT data into attribute data. Step 2, responding to changes through available process controls. Well, there's 2 steps. We have to find what those, how do we find what those responses are? That may be an optimization algorithm that on top of your machine learning models is recommending control actions. And we then need to somehow send those actions back to the actuators, so integrate with control systems. And then those outcomes, well, again, we want to try and improve consistency, and we're working towards real-time release. So let's take a look at step 1, the first pillar here, and let's break this down a little bit further. So what does a PAT adoption workflow look like? Well, in 4 high-level steps, somebody wants to define and carry. Somebody who wants to bring this PAT to a site will define and carry out lab experiments to validate the PAT. So does the science apply in the case that we're our current case? We then build predictive models for the attributes of interest. So, are we trying with the Raman spectra? Are we trying to predict glucose titer, so on? We evaluate that predictive model, and then we deploy that model to give us insights in real time as we're manufacturing. So as with the promise of PAT, this PAT adoption workflow gets a little bit more complicated as you peel back the layers. So let's take a look at what happens. So defining and carrying out lab experiments to validate PAT. So that's a pretty standard process. So it's a pretty standard process. The SME or the process scientist would design a DOE and carry that out to collect data. So you might have a lab scientist, the process SME involved. That may take you 1 month to run those experiments and collect that data. Now, the second step, this is where things get really interesting. So build a predictive model for the attributes of interest. Well, building that model can be quite challenging. So you've got to migrate data. So from the PAT, wherever you're collecting that, to some machine where you're doing your computation. And then within the machine that you're doing computation on, you have to navigate many software. So typically you may start in Excel, you may leverage Python for some data cleaning, preparation, merging, so your offline data with the spectral data. And then you might go to something like Simca to build your PLS or OPLS model. There's custom code, so you've got to clean the data, align the data. And then in the model, you're not doing this once, you're iterating on all of these steps. Now you've added another persona here, so you need a data scientist support, somebody who can program, somebody who has understanding of, GXP understanding of how you would develop and deploy these models. And now you're adding probably another month to your process. Next, you have to evaluate that predictive model. So this typically just culminates in writing a report. You're going to involve the quality department. Let's, conservatively estimate this at 2 weeks. It could be much longer than that. And that's where kind of the the knowledge transfer ends. It's all this knowledge is going to get stored in a report. And then you get to the point where you say, yep, I want to deploy that model. So how do we do that? Well, what we've seen is typically it's hacking a data pipeline. So you have to, basically, you're going to try to automate the workflow that you've gone through for this POC. So, those, especially that second step where you're navigating all those different software, moving data from one place to another, you'll try to write a lot of code to do all that for you. It's just automating without, automating in the simplest manner that you can. So it's going to be clunky. You might get a clunky solution for just displaying predictions. It's going to have limited capacity to leverage the outputs of this prediction. You're going to probably involve a software developer, your OT and IT SMEs. Your duration is going to be very likely much longer than 6 months. So that's what this current workflow looks like. Now, once you've gone through that, there's now GXP considerations that you have to keep in mind. How are you going to validate that pipeline? So how are you going to guarantee all that data correctness, the spectral data, the controls data, any offline lab samples data, exchanging so many hands? You've written code. You've got to manage that code. You've got to have access rights on that code. So that's, entire software, entire tech company, things that tech companies specialize in, that now your manufacturing company has to become well versed in. You're going to need a model development SOP. So what skill set do you require to build and modify these models? How often do you have to update them? What algorithms can you consider? Are you going to limit yourself to linear models that are explainable, or can you explore more advanced strategies? And what types of performance metrics are required to make the different GXP decisions that you're going to make? And finally, are you integrating this with other relevant data? How do you consume these calculations? Are you running back to a GXP environment? So there's a lot of considerations to be made here. So let me paint you a story of somebody going it alone. So somebody trying to build this internally. So you've got this process SME. One day he says, yep, I want to bring, I was reading this literature study. There's this great PAT that would be very useful for us. Let's run a POC. Let's see if we can bring it to our site. So they build that DOE, as I mentioned, collect the data. They pass it off to the data scientist. They go through that POC workflow and they say, yep, we've validated that this is going to work. We want to go ahead and now deploy this in our production environment. So they're going to bring on their OT and IT experts because they need to get access to make live connections to these data systems, which is fine. But then what you're going to find is although you've got a lot of software experts here, or you've got a lot of, computer systems experts, you don't have anybody to create a software to display these values. How are you going to be consuming this? So maybe you bring in a DevOps team to take care of this, to stitch something together, to navigate this whole complex landscape. So now the process SME is trying to wrangle all of these different members of the organization to achieve their goal. And this is really, it's an enormous project. It's not something that they can just add on to their existing workloads. So you now bring in an agile project manager to manage this project. So let's say that, after a long and painstaking experience where you're balancing different priorities of all these personnel, you get to a delivered product. Now, you've got two options when you're trying to get to that delivered product. You could draw out your timeline because you're trying to make it perfect on iteration 1, or you could have a phased deliverable. So in most cases, this is really a software development journey where you need to think about this in a phased approach. What are you going to deliver in version 1, and what are you going to hold off and deliver in your later versions of the product? So now you're talking version control. We all know that the first time we do something, it's not going to be perfect. And so this team now has to keep in mind that this is not something that they are doing once and being done with, but this is something that this is going to be a living, breathing system that they're going to be having to update and to make it better, to make it more user friendly. So that's what this is a very challenging journey if you when choosing to do it internally. So let's look at what it looks like when you use a modern. Let's look at what a modern PAT approach look like. And in this example, I'm going to use our Quartic platform as the example. But really, we're just saying if you bring in a modern data analytics platform, this can be all done much more seamlessly. So the Quartic platform in high level consists of 3 pillars. So we have a data pillar where we establish connections to the plant data sources. So that would be your historians, any LIMS or SQL databases. In this case, we would also tie into that spectral data and enable streaming in real time. We then build models on top of that. So UI guided workflows where the process SME can achieve the build the types of models that they need for their use cases. And then we also support applications. So in this case, we're talking about PAT, a specific PAT application for the user to be able to go build models, prepare the data, and deploy these models. So let's look at this modern PAT approach one layer at a time. So starting with the data connection. So I mentioned with this platform, we can connect to the data sources, any databases, the PAT streaming data. Now, what that looks like is you could have, a bioreactor with a PAT Raman probe. We connect that using a common industrial protocol, be that OPC perhaps, or a custom protocol as needed, and we store that in a data lake. So that in and of itself is a much more robust pipeline than that which can be stitched together using custom code. So all of these data connectors are that OPC UA connector that I referred to is an off-the-shelf connector, which is GXP ready. So just that single point where you now have a validated data pipeline, which is just a very small aspect of what a modern data platform can deliver, that is already making huge strides with regards to this PAT deployment. Let's look at the next steps. So no code modeling workflows. So you can design. So in something like our Quartic PAT application, the workflow for building models from PAT data is quite standardized. So begin with wavelength selection, so the user can select subsets of the spectral wavelengths. They need to align those wavelengths with offline lab samples. They need to do spectral filtering. So what types of filters are you using applying to that spectral data? You select the types of models. Are you going to only consider linear or nonlinear, more advanced models as well? And then you evaluate the model performance. So all of this is built into UI workflows, which are, again, also GXP ready, as I mentioned with that data pipeline. So you're no longer having to exchange this data from one software to another. It's not, you have that streaming data connection, and then you bring it directly to this application where you can go through that whole modeling workflow. And finally, we end with seamless deployment. So as part of this application, you can display new batches in real time. You can compare with historical batches. You could select one scan at a time to view the predicted CQA or output that's being what you're trying to characterize from the product. So with these 3 aspects, the data connection, the no-code modeling workflows, and this seamless deployment, now the process SME, after they've gone through and done their design of experiments, they've validated this, they can really go through this process themselves. So this could be done so they can go through this process themselves and to build these models, and that timeline of months and years can be reduced to a matter of weeks following the collection of data. And how do we deploy this? Well, there's 3 different levels. So we can look at offline integration where we don't make any connections to the shop floor data sources, that PAT. Everything is done by CSV upload. So it's still a significant improvement over the current workflow, because we're not everything once the data is ingested, and it doesn't have to be cleaned outside of the platform. Everything is done inside of the application. We can look at an online integration where we connect the PAT and any other data sources through an edge device and stream that directly so that we're able to get real-time data. Again, everything, the modeling workflow, the data preparation, it's all integral to that application. And then we can go all the way to optimal closed loop control. So we stream that data in, we make our calculations, and then we can write outputs back to a PLC controller. So maybe that controller can take action based on, the predicted glucose based on that spectral reading. So the benefits of this, well, there's significant reduction in time to value. So we're reducing from months and years to weeks. And the user can focus on the scientific and business benefits of the PAT without having to worry about all that software development and data integrations, the GXP. You go through this painstaking process of building all of this, which is one challenge, but then having to validate it all, just another challenge. So we eliminate those GXP consider. And as I mentioned, there's significantly more value available on the table. This was just scratching the surface of what these types of platforms can do. But there's so much more that's available. And so that brings us to the extensions. So this predicted soft tag, it could be written back to your modern data platform for trending. You could build alarms and thresholds on top of that. You could send it all the way back to a control system to take actions. You can build forecasting models. You can do model management within Quartic, and you can integrate with any other process tags for a complete view of the process. So with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation, and if there's any questions, I will be happy to address those now.